There's some talk that the federal government may look into taking resource rights away from the provinces. In Alberta, of course, we've got a lot of oil and gas here and other important resources. That could be quite concerning. Now, to talk about this in more detail is Lethbridge MP Rachael Thomas, who joins us now from Ottawa. Rachael, welcome back to Bridge City News.
Thanks, Hal. Great to be with you.
Yeah, you as well. Now, Rachael, Justice Minister David Lametti let it slip that the Trudeau Liberals should look into stripping resource rights away from the provinces. How concerned should we really be with this?
Yeah, Hal, I think it's important to start on the premise that, we live in an incredible province with incredible resources. And of course, the four prairie provinces can all boast the same. But here in Alberta, we have something particularly special, and that is, of course, access to oil and gas. And when we develop our natural resources, we do so with some of the highest environmental practices in the world, with some of the most ethical practices in the world, and then, of course, some of the highest wages in the world. And so these three things really set us apart when it comes to natural resource development. So instead of attacking that, I would be of the opinion that really Mr. Lametti should be praising that. He should be celebrating what's possible, within our prairie provinces and I dare say across the country. Not only that, but when these resources are developed, that results in dollars being spent on important infrastructure projects, as well, here in the province of Alberta, but then also, it benefits the entire country as a whole. Whether that's through transfer payments or other ways, through taxation also. So all of that is to say, when the natural resource sector is strong, Canada is strong. So for the minister to say such a thing was just absolutely ludicrous. It's incredibly divisive. It's incredibly dangerous. And the big reason why is not only because he's going after the industry, and in particular going after the four prairie provinces, but it's particularly dangerous because he's actually saying that the government is going to look into unilaterally changing the Constitution. Since when is it okay for a government to exert itself in such a capacity? So all that to say, I'm really proud of our leader, Pierre Poilievre, who has come out very strongly against Mr. Lametti's statement and is very much a proponent of leaving things with the provinces to determine on their own.
Rachael, senators returned to the upper chamber and quickly began debating a motion that would see the Senate accept Bill C-11, the Online Streaming Act, without insisting on further changes. Now, as our country's heritage critic, you say this raises a red flag. Why is that?
Yeah, certainly. Viewers will recall that Bill C-11 is the government's online censorship bill. So really, with this bill, the government is giving itself the ability to control what Canadians can see, hear, and post online. Essentially, it will break our search bars. So when we go on YouTube looking for videos we want to see, instead of that, it'll be videos the government wants us to see. When we look for content using a Google search bar, and again, looking for things we want to find, instead, it'll be things that the government would prefer we look at. This is dangerous. This is incredibly dangerous. There have been some legal experts who have said this takes us down a path toward becoming like China or North Korea, Russia or Iran. Obviously, these are countries we do not want to liken to when it comes to respect for constitutional rights. So at the end of the day, this bill has it went from the House of Commons over to the Senate. The Senate made some changes, sent it back to the House of Commons. The government rejected the vast majority of those Senate changes, which is very unfortunate because, of course, the Senate exists to be a sober second thought. And some of their amendments were great and they should have been accepted. And so it was really sad that the government rejected those. The Senate now is looking at the bill once again. And the supposedly independent senators have said that they're simply going to let it pass as is. They're not going to fight the fight any further, which I think is a really sad day for Canadians, because I think we depend on those who are given a position of authority to defend us. We depend on them to do so. And unfortunately, the supposedly independent senators are choosing to abdicate their voice and their responsibility by pushing through a piece of legislation that they know, by their own admission, is incredibly dangerous and will harm Canadians. That said, I would encourage audience members certainly to still continue to have a voice on this. I think we still have an opportunity to write to senators and to urge them, please vote no to this. Do not let this piece of legislation pass as is, because it is incredibly harmful to Canadians.
Rachael, Canadian farmers are applauding the passage of Bill C-234. It exempts farm fuels from the federal government's carbon tax. How important is this really for our agricultural communities, especially here in southwestern Alberta?
I can only comment on what I'm hearing from farmers themselves. I think that's probably, the best voice to listen to. I know that this bill means a lot to them. So this bill comes from my colleague, Ben Lobb, a Conservative member of Parliament here in the House of Commons who serves with me. It was his idea. He drove it forward and ultimately gained the support of the NDP and the Bloc, and we were successful in putting it through. That being the case, it is of tremendous benefit to farmers because we know that these are the men and women who work remarkably hard to serve our country, to make sure that we're fed, but not only us, but to make sure that the world is fed. And this is something to be celebrated. And unfortunately, we have a government that chooses not to. Instead, they like to put policies in place that are incredibly restrictive toward farmers, if not an outright attack, whether it's regulations regarding fertilizer or the carbon tax. So the fact that, my colleague has been so successful in getting this bill through and farmers will now be exempt from the carbon tax being applied to their fuel, I think it's just a huge win for farmers. And certainly they've spoken out and given a significant endorsement of this legislation.
Let's talk about that carbon tax. Went up again April 1st. How damaging has it been for families across the country?
Yeah, and again, a very important question because we know that the carbon tax impacts all of us, whether it's our home heating or the cost of groceries that we're purchasing at the store, or the fuel that we put in our vehicles to drive to work or take our kids to sport practice. The carbon tax is applied to literally everything that we depend on in life in one form or another. The carbon tax is something that this Liberal government is very committed to. They like to virtue signal that they care about the environment and therefore are applying this carbon tax. But yet when we look at the metrics, when we actually look at whether or not they're hitting the environmental targets that they've set for themselves, we see that they're not. They haven't met a single environmental target during their entire 8 years in government. So it's simply more rhetoric. And at the end of the day, it's purely punitive toward Canadians because it's not actually accomplishing, what it was supposed to be. So at the end of the day, we're huge proponents on our side of scrapping the carbon tax and putting practices in place that are common sense and that will actually make a real difference in terms of making sure that we're stewarding our earth.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, was called to testify recently into foreign election interference. Now, you're not happy with what you heard from Ms. Telford. Can you explain why?
So I had the opportunity to be at committee just last week, and during the committee, of course, Ms. Telford, the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, testified. I guess I could sum it up as this. I would say she certainly engaged in tactics of avoidance and deflection, half answers. And so it was very, very difficult to get a sense of what is true and what is not. That said, there were a couple of statements that she made very emphatically that I think are quite telling. One of them, she said that the Prime Minister reads everything that is put in front of him. The other statement that she made is that nothing is ever withheld from the Prime Minister. Nothing is ever kept from the Prime Minister. What this tells us then is if he has access to all information and if he reads all information given to him, then he must have known. He must have known that there was Beijing interference in both the 2019 and 2021 elections. The reason we know he must have known is because he reads everything and nothing is kept from him. And we know that CSIS, our foremost intelligence agency in this country, put forward reports to his office. So therefore, we could only conclude that the Prime Minister was aware and chose to turn a blind eye to the fact that this interference was taking place. Why would he do that? Because we have it on record in these CSIS reports that Beijing wanted the Liberals to win and was putting money in those ridings illegally, and Beijing businesses were hiring interns to place them on campaigns in order to help Liberal candidates. So at the end of the day, wow, we're led to conclude that we have a Prime Minister who turned a blind eye to the CSIS reports, the intelligence reports, and instead allowed these elections to be interfered in by Beijing because it worked to his advantage. So that's a very sad day for democracy in Canada.
That's incredible. Rachael, some people are not happy with the fact that MPs received another raise recently. Not only is the carbon tax going up, but MPs, hey, the salaries went up, including yours. Was there ever any discussion by your party to decline the raises when so many Canadians are still struggling with the rising cost of living?
Yeah, certainly. I think it is a point well taken. There's legislation that's in place that members of parliament and senators, their wages go up year over year. There's nothing that we do for that or against that. It simply is. And so the government of the day would have to make a decision to put new legislation in place. That was something that we did when we were in power as Conservatives. Harper put a freeze on that. The Liberals have chosen to bring it back. That said, I would recognize that, yes, Canadians are struggling. And then I would have to beg the question, well, why is that? It's because of the current government that's in place right now. It's because their spending is totally out of control, which is driving up inflation. And it's because they're increasing taxes on Canadians. And so at the end of the day, Canadians are stuck with this massive bill. And the reality is that their employers are not keeping up with wage increases, in part because they can't, because they're finding it hard to run their businesses and to be able to make a profit, to be able to pay their employees well. So that's certainly part of it, which again comes down to government policy needing to change. And so I guess the conclusion I would offer is that government matters, policy matters, and we should be looking to drive investment into our country. We should be looking to drive up wages because of that investment in our country, and ultimately we should be looking to drive down the cost of living. Again, government policy and government spending has a lot to do with this.
NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says he'll continue to prop up the Trudeau government and not pull the plug on the coalition until at least 2025. So, Rachel, let me ask you something. You're on the Hill, you're in Ottawa right now. What do you think it will take for Singh to potentially pull the plug sooner rather than later?
Oof. Again, great question. I guess I would offer an observation perhaps, and that is, when I stand in the House day in and day out and I listen to the Liberal members of Parliament, this just happened yesterday. We were having a discussion with regards to the budget. So all day long, I listened to NDP members get up and rail on the government, either because there were things in the budget that they disagreed with, or there were things missing from the budget that they were hoping would be there. And so they spent the entire day debating and making points against the government. And then in the evening, it came for a vote. And what did the NDP do? They stood in favor with the government. So I find it interesting then that we have a party that is willing to speak out of one side of their face against the government, but then out of the other side of their face, they're willing to speak in favor of the government in the sense of a vote. And so the discrepancy there is one that I'm not able to reconcile. And I think it's difficult for a lot of Canadians to be able to reconcile. So at the end of the day, I'm not sure what it's going to take to break up this cozy union. But the NDP seem very dedicated to abandoning their principles and upholding this government no matter what it takes.
Wow. Rachel, there's still a massive doctor shortage in many parts of our province, including here in Lethbridge. Now, the UCP say they're bringing in 17 more doctors. 6 are apparently practicing here, another 11, I think, expected by the end of the year. How important is that working relationship between the federal and provincial governments to address physician shortages, not just here in Alberta, but across the country?
Mm-hmm. This is definitely a significant issue in our area and has been for a little while now. And so I was pleased to see that we have 17 doctors coming into the city of Lethbridge. I think there's an opportunity there for sure for provincial, federal, and municipal governments to work well together. In order to address the shortage, we do have to bring individuals in from other countries. One of the things that our city and province have been working really well on is actually to streamline that process. So making sure that credentials are honored and that where there is extra training or education needed, that it's delivered in a timely fashion. And so there was actually a recent article that came out not too long ago that actually was praising the city of Lethbridge for its approach and its partnership with the province on this matter. And this is actually a model that's being looked at in other places of the country. So it's this effect where you're basically cutting back on the red tape, you're streamlining the process, you're making sure that people are credentialed properly, and that anything that needs to be brought up to date is in a quick manner. What this does then is it allows individuals to start practicing quite quickly. The other thing that's happening within the city of Lethbridge in order to attract doctors is actually just a really personal approach. One might call it hospitality. So essentially wanting to talk about the good things about Lethbridge and all that it has to offer, especially to those who might be looking to raise a family in our city. And it seems to be attracting the type of people who want to be in a small urban center like ours rather than the larger ones. And so by attracting those individuals who are looking for that type of environment, it means that they're more likely to stay rather than us losing them in a few years once their contract comes to an end.
Lethbridge Conservative MP and Canadian heritage critic Rachael Thomas, thanks so much for joining us today from our nation's capital.
Thanks, Hal. Good to be with you.